Thank you. Yes, so I work for EEF. It's the, if I go this side actually, the Engineers Employers Federation historically, but now we have rebranded ourselves as the Manufacturers Organisation. And we have around 6,000 manufacturers in direct membership, all operating within England and Wales. And we have about 20,000 associate members. And I work in EEF's policy and representation team, working on particularly environment policy. And it's our job to try and, our best, to try and ensure that when policy is designed, it encourages and incentivizes the right sort of behaviours. So we're very interested in understanding what's happening within the wider manufacturing community, what are the barriers that are preventing progress from being made, and how policy can be designed to overcome those barriers. And so what I wanted to share with you today was some survey data that we have recently looking at the kind of progress and penetration of some of the business models and enablers, if you like, to some of these system changes that have been discussed at length today. First of all, just to go back to the context, now it's been mentioned quite a few times today. This image is from the Government Office for Science's recent report into the future of manufacturing. And well, I say recent, it's not so recent anymore, but it's a fantastic piece of work involving hundreds of experts and practitioners and underpinned by some very high quality research papers. And it points to a future of resource constraints and that manufacturers in future will have to renegotiate their relationships with their customers, with their suppliers, by thinking through how they design and market their products and the business models they use to do that. And it suggests that over the next 10 years, the focus will be all on efficiency, very much what we see or have seen in the last 5-10 years. And only in 2025, 2050, that we'll start to see more experimentation with new systems. And of course, we've heard today that there are some leading companies that are already doing that. And certainly we think that manufacturers can benefit from moving into this space more rapidly. And that there's a huge commercial opportunity from getting involved in these business models. So service-based business models or servitization, I'm sure you've heard much about it today, but moving from that linear transactional relationship with the product to one where you are selling the service, changing your relationship with customers, changing your relationship with the product. What we've found is in our own data, and it's been also substantiated with a growing body of evidence, is that this can create new and resilient revenue streams. And so this picture is actually from Aston Centre for Servitization, and it did some work that looked to say that companies that move into servitization can expect to see sustained annual business growth of around 5 to 10% per annum and 25 to 30% lower customer costs. And so, in short, it builds very high barriers of entry for competitors. And that really reflects some of the trends that we've been seeing within the manufacturing community, within our membership over the recent years. The EEF members have been offering services to their customers to defend their market position in the face of unrelenting pressure from lower cost competitors. So it's really these competitive pressures which have forced manufacturers to look at these service offerings in the main. And it's only kind of thereafter that they've really started to understand and realise the resource efficiency benefits that come with it. And so, we've seen fantastic LCA data from some of the companies operating this space, which suggests that they can reduce their operational energy use by 85%, reduce their material dependencies or virgin material consumption by 85%, reduce the amount of chemicals they're using on site, improve their health and safety performance, reduce the amount of water they're using on site. It's a fantastic sustainability story as well, as you all know. So I want to talk a little bit about two areas which I think are quite good indicators for penetration of this thinking within the manufacturing community. I did that too quickly, sorry. So remanufacturing and service offering. I suppose a word of caution first, that there doesn't seem to be an accepted definition of remanufacturing within the manufacturing community. While everyone in this room, I'm sure, has a very good understanding on what it means, you will talk to manufacturers. We do follow-up interviews with our members, and some will think it's closed-loop recycling. Others think because they recycle some of their plastic cut-offs, it's reman. So we need to take this data very cautiously. But I think, nevertheless, I think it does reflect some of the trends that we'll expect to see. So I think there is a certain degree of validity in them. Our sample size as well was around 150, which is probably quite standard for EEF surveys, but quite a small sample nevertheless. So with that kind of context, we asked our members, whether they had ever been involved in remanufacturing, were they considering it, was it even on their radar? And actually, a lot of companies did say that they were involved, and what we would expect to see certainly is quite a high degree of reman occurring in the transport sector, where it's happening under the radar. End-of-life vehicles directive has potentially helped foster a policy environment or an environment to enable it. And there's the dealership and the supply chain structure, which also is helpful in supporting reman of components of cars and other vehicles. And then we, as you probably might expect, it drops off quite rapidly in other sectors. Metals, it's incredibly low. And certainly I think companies working in the metal sector are really struggling to understand kind of how they can fit into these circular economy types of discussions and concepts. How will it work for them? And electrical and optical, which I think a lot of the focus is on actually when we talk about circular economy, or certainly when the policymakers talk about circular economy, it's really electronics and that they've got in front of their mind often. It's no surprise that reman is incredibly low. While there are examples, and I think the classic ones are the Sony PlayStation and the Sky set-top boxes, but it's still incredibly low, reflecting the speed of innovation within the sector and the long supply chains as well. I think what I found quite interesting is actually when people began to think about it, very few had actually rejected it. So we see very, very low levels of rejection once companies have started to think about it. But as you can see, there's huge amounts of companies. This is not even on their radar. Half of manufacturers have not even considered it at all. And they probably don't understand what remanufacturing is. So we have an issue around semantics straight off, and a huge knowledge gap that we need to overcome if we want to see greater penetration of reman within the manufacturing community. Equally, there is similar levels of, a third of manufacturers haven't considered offering services to prolong their product's life. But saying that, there's a lot of companies that are engaged in this, and I think actually the whole language around servitization, offering services, it's a lot more accessible, I think, to a wider number of manufacturers. And so we can see greater levels of penetration across all sectors. There's They're also, electronics, machinery and transport are all particularly engaged in this agenda, and they're also those most likely to be considering new service opportunities in the near future. But I want to kind of highlight another kind of split of the data, because I think the sector issue is important, but equally, when you look at the data according to turnover, we start to see some quite stark sectorial differences. So it's quite plain here that small and medium-sized companies are significantly less likely to have considered remanufacturing than their larger counterparts. Large companies appear to be much more engaged with this concept and really considering it, or planning to in the coming months, whereas if you look at the companies with turnovers under £2 million a year, it's not on their radar. Not one company said they were actively considering it. Smaller companies as well are also likely to reject it, although it's broadly similar. And a similar pattern emerges when we look at services. What's immediately clear is that this is much more accessible to the medium-sized companies, but the smaller ones, the ones with the lowest turnover, are also struggling too with this concept as well. And I think it goes, I think it's because of what we were talking about earlier, actually, that it's that ability to have a capacity to experiment and to draw from a wider range of skill sets around the company. Whereas SMEs are kind of traditionally thought to be much more nimble than their larger counterparts. They don't really have the space to experiment in the same way that maybe the larger companies have. Our evidence suggests this is very much in the realm of the larger companies who have the resources and space and skills to really get their teeth into this. And finally, I just want to kind of highlight some of the barriers that we found as we were interviewing our members. So this is the balance of views. And we wanted to understand why they weren't thinking about it, what was holding things back. Because if policymakers, consultants, you guys are thinking about the tools, techniques and policies that are likely to drive action, we need to really, really understand why. And there are 5 clear drivers, and they're pretty consistent when you look at the whole range of environmental issues. A lack of management time is always top, we find in many of our surveys. So it's kind of weird because the board support is always there. The board clearly support it, they can see their benefits very clearly, but management failed to prioritise it. And partly we think that's because of a lack of knowledge and expertise, because the government isn't driving activity in this area, although I think it's questionable whether you can legislate for this sort of business model. But they certainly aren't driving it through their public procurement policies and sharing examples as well as they could do. There's quite a lot of companies who report that there's an unsupportive regulatory environment. So I was talking to a company an SME based up in Newcastle who remanufacture transformers. Transformers are currently being dealt with under the Eco Design Directive as an energy-using product, but there's no mention of remanufactured goods. So it put them in a kind of legal grey space. They weren't sure where their product fell and what their business model would look like in an environment where they were then expected to drive down energy conductivity in the casing of the transformers they were remanufacturing. So there are these grey legal areas which are preventing, I think, some businesses from going or preventing some companies from moving into that space. That's a little kind of snapshot of some of the evidence that we've gathered recently. And that's it from me. Thank you.